The first red flag was when she showed up to the rehearsal in a neon vest labeled HOA Patrol. I wish I was joking. I'm Yarden Elridge, 35, owner of the Maple Hollow Estate, an outdoor wedding venue I bought with every dime I had after leaving my job in construction management. My fiancée, Elira, and I had planned to get married right there on the main lawn under the blooming dogwoods. We'd invited about 90 people, kept it classy, and even got a noise permit from the county. But apparently, none of that mattered to Brenda. Brenda Halbrook, the HOA secretary and self-declared enforcer of the community rules. Middle-aged, sharp chin, and a voice that could cut glass, she lived 2 streets away and had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. Except in her head. As guests began arriving for the Friday evening rehearsal, Brenda stormed up the gravel path like she was leading a SWAT raid. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a concert venue," she barked, waving a clipboard like it was a holy relic. "This violates HOA Code 17-B, I stayed calm. "Brenda, this isn't part of the HOA. Maple Hollow is zoned commercial. It's why I bought it." She didn't even blink. "Irrelevant. Your guests are parking on community roads." "I've already filed a complaint." Elira walked over, staying composed but clearly annoyed. "We've arranged off-site parking with a shuttle. There won't be any cars on the street tomorrow." Brenda ignored her completely. "Too late. I'll be bringing this up at the next board meeting. And if this wedding happens, I'm calling the sheriff." I laughed, thinking she was bluffing. "Call whoever you want. I own this land. Tomorrow's happening." She narrowed her eyes. "We'll see about that." The next day was perfect clear skies, soft breeze, and every chair filled. Elira looked stunning, the music was soft, and the officiant had just begun when sirens. 2 sheriff cruisers pulled up at the edge of the venue. You could hear the tension ripple through the crowd. Brenda stood at the property line with her arms crossed, proud like she'd just saved the neighborhood from a terrorist. A deputy approached me. "We received a noise complaint and a report of an unauthorized gathering." I handed him the permits. "I own this venue. Everything's legal." "She's just mad we didn't invite her." The deputy looked over the paperwork, nodded, then turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, this isn't under HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing." Brenda's smile froze. "No, I'm not. I live. You're interrupting a permitted event. You need to leave." She refused. So they escorted her off the property. In front of everyone, some guests clapped. One of the flower girls shouted, "Bye, crazy lady." I could see Brenda fuming as she got into her car, but what I didn't know was that this wasn't her last move, not even close. I didn't hear from Brenda for over a week after the wedding. Just long enough for me to think maybe she'd realized she'd overplayed her hand. Elira and I flew out for a short honeymoon in Oregon, came back refreshed, and got straight to work on prepping the venue for a string of summer bookings. Business was finally gaining traction. I'd even hired 2 part-time groundskeepers to keep up with the lawns and gardens. Then I received a letter. Not from the HOA, from the county zoning commission. It was a formal notice of investigation. Apparently, there'd been an anonymous tip that the Maple Hollow estate was operating without proper zoning compliance, conducting unlicensed commercial events, and violating local sound ordinances. I drove straight to the zoning office. The clerk, a woman named Rayanne, was friendly but firm. "Mr. Elridge, we're required to follow up on all formal complaints. This one included signed affidavits and photographic evidence." I leaned forward. "Evidence of what?" She turned her monitor toward me. There were photos of the wedding, the chairs, the floral arch, even the buffet setup. All taken from behind bushes or through gaps in the fence line. One angle came from an upstairs window, likely someone on a ladder. Creepy didn't begin to cover it. I asked who filed the complaint. She tapped the screen. The documents came from the West Garden Estates Homeowners Association. Signed by their acting secretary, Brenda Halbrook. I could feel the heat rising in my face. "This isn't even their jurisdiction." Rayanne nodded. "Which is why the investigator flagged it. But because of the volume of material and the tone of the complaint, we have to follow through. We're sending someone next week." The following days were a scramble. I had to dig up every permit, every inspection report, and every zoning certificate I'd ever filed. I even called the county registrar to confirm nothing had changed. Everything was in order, but it took time I should have spent managing events. Elira paced the office that evening with a folder in hand. She's not going to stop. She's trying to bury us in red tape. Doesn't matter if we're legal, she just wants to drain us. She picked the wrong people to mess with, I said, pulling up my laptop. I'm not just going to defend this, I'm going to find out how far this goes. That night I started digging, not just into Brenda but into the HOA itself. I found their bylaws, public meeting minutes, and more interestingly their financial filings from the past 3 years. They weren't a corporate HOA, just a community association under a nonprofit umbrella. Still, they had to publicly file annual reports, and that's where I noticed it. A transfer of funds. Nearly $15,000 moved from the Community Reserve Fund into something labeled Neighborhood Enforcement Initiative. That was just 2 months before our wedding. I cross-checked board meeting minutes. No mention of a vote. Just a vague note. Funds reallocated to support compliance efforts. I called my friend Hector, a local attorney who'd helped me incorporate Maple Hollow when I first bought it. That's a big transfer for an HOA of that size, he said. If it wasn't approved by the homeowners, it's misappropriation, possibly embezzlement. And if she used that money to pay for surveillance or legal filings against me, then she's weaponizing community funds for personal vendettas. That's not just unethical. That's fraud. We decided to dig deeper. Hector filed a formal public records request for all correspondence between the HOA and the zoning board. In the meantime, I installed 2 new security cameras, one at the north fence line and one facing the rear easement, where the photos had clearly been taken. 3 nights later, we caught her. It was nearly midnight. Elira and I were watching a movie when I got a ping on my phone motion alert. I pulled up the feed and saw her on the rear path, crouched in the brush with a flashlight and a camera. She was taking photos of the maintenance shed. I called the sheriff. By the time deputies arrived, she was still there, crouched behind a hydrangea bush. They found a folder in her car with dozens of printed photos of the property, some of which clearly showed guests and even children. She had a list of names and dates scrawled on notepads, and a printed satellite map with markings and notes. They charged her with trespassing and unlawful surveillance. But that wasn't the worst of it. The next morning, we got a call from the county investigator. He'd received the public records request and reviewed the HOA's submitted documentation. The letter Brenda provided had been doctored. The zoning complaint she filed had included a forged signature from a supposed neighboring property owner. Only one problem. That property owner had passed away 2 years ago. Now it was a criminal matter. She'd submitted fraudulent documents to a government office, a felony. The sheriff's department launched a formal investigation. Elira and I gave them a copy of the camera footage, the folder retrieved from her car, and the forged letters. Hector submitted a complaint to the state HOA Oversight Committee. It turned out this wasn't Brenda's first time pushing boundaries, just the first time someone fought back. Within the week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't a member, but several residents invited me to attend as a guest. They were furious. Brenda had never consulted them before filing complaints or reallocating community funds. A wiry man named Thomas, the HOA president, stood at the front and read from a prepared statement. It has come to our attention that the secretary of this association acted unilaterally, misused association funds, and submitted fraudulent materials to county officials. This board does not condone these actions and has voted to terminate her position effective immediately. Most of the residents clapped. One woman stood up and asked if they'd be refunding the money she'd spent on a fence that Brenda had ordered removed last year. Another man said Brenda had fined his daughter for having a lemonade stand one summer. It was like everyone had been waiting for a crack, and now the dam had burst. Outside after the meeting, Thomas approached me. "She's been a problem for years," he said quietly. "But nobody wanted to get into a legal fight. You forced it into the light." "Thank you," I nodded. "You want to make it right, audit everything she touched, and give the community some transparency for once." They did. 2 weeks later, the county dropped the investigation into Maple Hollow. The zoning board issued a formal apology for the stress caused by the complaint. Brenda, meanwhile, was facing 3 misdemeanor charges and 1 felony count for the forgery. The best part? A few of the homeowners, including Thomas, asked if they could rent the venue for their own events. Turns out, once Brenda was out of the picture, they realized the place was actually a gem. Elira smiled when the first check came in. "So, you still worried about wedding karma?" "Not anymore," I said, flipping the reserved sign onto the gate. Brenda gave us more advertising than we could have ever paid for. We never heard from her again, but the security cameras stayed. Just in case. 2 months after Brenda was removed from the HOA board and charged, Maple Hollow was booked nearly every weekend. Word had spread quickly not just about the venue's charm, but the fact that we'd stood up to the kind of nonsense most people just grumbled about. A retired firefighter and his wife rented the grounds for a vow renewal. A local jazz trio used the gazebo for a summer concert. Even a city councilman's niece held her quinceañera under the dogwoods. But while things were finally moving forward for us, the fallout from Brenda's actions was far from over. I was in the middle of pressure washing the stone walkway one morning when a gray sedan pulled up along the gravel. A man in a pressed shirt stepped out and flashed a badge district attorney's office. "Yarden Elridge?" he asked. I turned off the washer and wiped my hands on a towel. "That's me. I'm Investigator Neil. I need to ask you a few questions related to an ongoing investigation into the West Garden Estates HOA." I led him into the office and offered him water, which he declined. He opened a folder, revealing more paperwork than I'd expected. Not just photos, but checks, receipts, and what looked like internal memos. "Would you say Brenda Halbrook acted alone in targeting your business?" I leaned back. "She's the only one who ever confronted me directly, but if you're asking if someone else helped her." "I wouldn't be surprised." He nodded once. "We've uncovered evidence that suggests other members of the HOA board may have known about the forged documents she submitted. There are emails, some of them signed off by the treasurer and vice president, that reference preemptive compliance measures and protecting property values through outside intervention." I didn't say anything. "I didn't have to," Neil continued. "One of the emails was sent the day before she filed the zoning complaint against you. It contains an attachment labeled Elridge Packet." I raised an eyebrow. "So they planned it." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We believe so. There's even reference to a private investigator. One invoice shows a payment for discreet surveillance of potential nuisance property." I stood up and paced. "They paid someone to spy on us. They used HOA funds to do it. That's where things get serious. Misusing nonprofit funds under the guise of community enforcement is one thing. But using it to pay for unauthorized surveillance crosses into criminal territory." I pointed at the folder. "So what happens next?" The DA is preparing charges. Not just for Brenda, they'll be going after the treasurer, the VP, and possibly the president, depending on how much he knew. Financial crimes, conspiracy, and unlawful surveillance. Possibly even identity fraud, since a forged signature was used in a government filing. "Let me know if you need me in court." "We will." Later that day, I called Hector and filled him in. He was already ahead of me. "You're not the only one they went after," he said, flipping through something on his end. "They fined a single mother for running a daycare out of her home, even though she had a license. They cited a retired veteran for a flagpole that had been up for years. This wasn't about rules, it was about control." I asked how many people had submitted complaints. 10 so far, and I'm about to file a class action." Elira was reading through a new catering contract when I told her. She didn't even look up. "Good. Let them feel what it's like to be held accountable." By the following week, the story had hit local media. It started with a small blog that focused on neighborhood politics, but once the DA's office confirmed the charges, it spread quickly. The headline read, HOA accused of conspiracy and fraud in targeted campaign against local wedding venue. A news van even showed up while we were setting up for a Sunday ceremony. The couple didn't mind, they thought it was great publicity. The real turning point came during the preliminary hearing. I was subpoenaed, along with 2 other homeowners. I took the stand and detailed everything from the forged documents to the midnight surveillance. Hector submitted our security footage into evidence, along with the time-stamped files Brenda had stored in that folder in her car. The judge didn't look amused. Then came the kicker. The court-appointed forensic accountant revealed that over $30,000 money collected from HOA dues had been funneled into what they labeled unauthorized initiatives. Payments had gone to a private investigator with a revoked license, a printer company that specialized in document forgery, unwittingly or not, and even a shell consulting firm that had no registered employees. That firm traced back to a P.O. box rented by Brenda's cousin. The courtroom went cold. The treasurer tried to claim ignorance. The VP insisted the paperwork had been altered without her knowledge, but the emails told a different story. One message from the VP read, "Let's just hope he folds before this hits the fan." He didn't. I didn't. The judge ordered an immediate audit of the HOA's finances and referred the case to a grand jury. Brenda's bail was revoked after she was caught attempting to access the HOA's online records using a neighbor's Wi-Fi. The treasurer was arrested for falsifying financial statements. The VP struck a deal and agreed to testify. The HOA was dissolved by court order 2 weeks later. Residents were given the option to form a new community association, but this time under a strict charter with third-party oversight. Thomas, the former president who'd helped remove Brenda, declined any leadership role. "I'm done," he told me when we bumped into each other at the feed store. "Someone else can deal with the paperwork. I just want to mow my lawn without a committee vote." The court awarded partial restitution to affected parties. I received a settlement to cover the legal costs and lost business from the weeks we'd spent under investigation. The mother who ran the daycare. She used her payout to build a new playroom. The veteran with the flagpole. The judge ordered the HOA to pay for a new one, gold eagle topper and all. Elira and I took a weekend trip to the mountains after the final ruling. Just us, no phones, no interruptions. We hiked a trail that ended at a high overlook, the kind of place where the only sounds were wind and birds. She sat beside me on a flat rock, watching the sky shift colors. "You think they regret it?" she asked, not looking away from the view. I shrugged. "Does it matter?" She smiled, slow and steady. "Not really." When we got back, we found a note slipped under the office door. It was from one of the newer residents, someone who'd moved in just before the whole thing started. It was handwritten on cream stationery. "Thank you for standing your ground. Most of us didn't know how bad it had gotten. You didn't just protect your business, you gave this neighborhood a backbone." Attached was a check. Full rental fee for her daughter's graduation party. I pinned the note on the corkboard above my desk. Not because of the money, but because it reminded me of something Brenda never understood. Power doesn't come from rules and fines. It comes from trust, from people choosing to stand behind you when it matters. And once that happens, no clipboard in the world can stop it. 3 months after the trial, the last of the debris was gone, both literal and metaphorical. Brenda had accepted a plea deal that permanently barred her from serving on any HOA board in the state. The treasurer was ordered to serve 2 years of probation and repay nearly $20,000 in restitution. The vice president's testimony earned her a suspended sentence and a reputation in the neighborhood that would follow her longer than any legal record. But for me and Elira, the real work was just beginning. The scandal had turned Maple Hollow into something of a local legend. Couples who never would have considered an outdoor venue were now requesting tours just to see the place where it all happened. We updated the website, added a virtual walkthrough, and started offering midweek discounts for smaller events. Business was steady, but something still felt unfinished. One morning, as I was reviewing contractor quotes for a new reception pavilion, Elira leaned against the doorway and crossed her arms. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the residents." I looked up. "What about them?" They survived years of that board. People who didn't even realize what was being done in their name. What if we gave them a place to meet that wasn't just a folding table in someone's garage? I set the quote aside. "You want to build a community center?" "No, not a center, just space, a real place, neutral ground. Somewhere decisions can happen in daylight instead of behind fences." I nodded slowly. "You're thinking long game, aren't you?" We held a meeting the following Saturday at the venue, open invite. No agenda, no politics, just coffee, folding chairs, and a big easel pad. 32 residents showed up. Some brought kids. The woman who'd sent us the handwritten note brought homemade muffins and a stack of paper cups. We asked one question: "What do you want this neighborhood to become?" Answers came slowly at first, then faster. People were tired of being told what to do by people they never voted for. They wanted transparency, real elections, and the ability to veto ridiculous rules before they became law. By the end of the meeting, someone had drawn up a draft for a new charter on the back of a catering invoice. We helped them file the paperwork for a neighborhood cooperative, not an HOA, but a nonprofit that operated democratically. No fines, no secret meetings, just a board of 5 rotating volunteers and a public ledger accessible by anyone. The residents voted to name it Willow Bend Collective. It took 2 months to finalize the transition. The old HOA's bank account was emptied by court order, and the remaining funds, just under $6,000, were transferred to the collective. They used it to build a covered bulletin board, install solar-powered path lights, and host their first official block party. I stayed out of the leadership. So did Elira. It was never about taking over, it was about giving people the tools to take back what had been hijacked by fear and control. One afternoon, while I was loading chairs into the storage shed after a retirement party, a man I didn't recognize walked up the drive. He was in his 50s, wore a faded military cap, and had the kind of handshake that left no room for doubt. "You're the guy," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Which guy?" "The one who didn't flinch when they came for you. My daughter lives 2 blocks away. She told me everything." I nodded, unsure what to say. He handed me a manila envelope. "I used to work internal affairs, military side, retired now, but I still do consulting. Thought you might want a copy of this." Inside were documents, emails Brenda had sent to a former HOA president 5 years earlier. They outlined a plan to quietly rezone the neighborhood into a gated community, with the HOA acquiring surrounding parcels through liens and forced sales. Maple Hollow had been on that list. She was playing the long game, he said, but she got sloppy and too eager. I flipped through the pages, stunned. This goes back years. She had contacts in the county assessor's office. 2 of them have been let go since this surfaced. "That's why I brought it to you. You deserve to know." We shook hands again, and he left without another word. Later that evening, Elira and I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip behind the dogwoods. I told her about the documents. She didn't look surprised. "Explains why she was so desperate," she said. "She wasn't just trying to ruin our wedding, she was trying to protect the last domino." We debated whether to go public with it. In the end, we decided not to. The people who needed to be exposed already had been, and the rest, well, they were just pawns in a game that never should have been played. Instead, we gave the documents to the new board of the Willow Bend Collective with one condition: transparency. Let the community decide what to do with them, if anything. No secrets, no vendettas. A month later, the collective voted to publish a redacted version of the documents on their website, not to shame, but to educate. A line at the top read, Proof that sunlight is the best disinfectant. The final twist came in an envelope from the state licensing board. Brenda's plea deal included a mandatory ethics course and a 5-year ban from holding any public office or position of authority in a registered community organization. Her name was added to a statewide watch list for misuse of nonprofit power. Elira read the letter and set it down with a satisfied breath. That's about as close to poetic justice as we're gonna get, I agreed. The following spring, we finished construction on the new reception pavilion. It had wide beams, soft lighting, and a stone hearth for cooler nights. We called it the Hollow Hearth, a nod to the venue, sure, but also to the battle we'd fought and won. At the grand opening, the very first event was a free concert hosted by the Willow Bend Collective. A local bluegrass band played under the pavilion while families danced on the lawn. Kids ran through the grass barefoot. One of the older residents brought a photo album from the 70s and passed it around, pointing out how things used to be. Near the end of the night, as the music slowed and the fireflies came out, Elira leaned her head against my shoulder. "We didn't just beat her," she said softly. "We changed everything." I looked around at the people laughing under the string lights, neighbors who had once been strangers now sharing stories and folding chairs. "No," I said. "They did." She smiled, and we sat in silence, letting the moment stretch. We never heard from Brenda again. Rumor had it she moved to a condo in a gated retirement community 4 counties away. If she tried to run for anything there, I hoped they asked her a few extra questions. As for Maple Hollow, it became more than a venue. It became a symbol. Not of what we'd lost, but of what we'd reclaimed, and that, more than any fine or court ruling, was the victory that mattered.